The Palamarola Air Base is only a staging post for the American troops who've been pouring into Honduras. The plan is for them to link up with Honduran troops and perform joint maneuvers. The exercise is already underway. This morning, 1,000 men were parachuted into the Honduran jungle. The administration is still trying to explain exactly what the troops are doing there. George Schultz, testifying before a congressional committee yesterday, was pressed to say how the troops can be a deterrent if a combat role has been ruled out.
They increase our presence, and they do it in a visible way that gets people's attention, and I must say that's worked. It does get people's attention.
As the troops arrived, there was a reminder of the volatility along the border, a Honduran airstrike inside Nicaragua that sent a group of journalists scurrying for cover. The journalists had been brought by Sandinista troops to be shown ammunition supplies apparently taken from retreating Contras. And the Sandinistas are playing the public relations game for all that it's worth. A senior spokesman appearing on American television to play on American fears of another Vietnam.
We are going to defend ourselves, and if any one of those U.S. helicopters happens to wander over our airspace, and we understand that helicopters are going to begin ferrying Honduran troops into the region, well, you just might have a new Gulf of Tonkin situation, and we all know what happened in Vietnam.
There is real concern about the possibility of direct American involvement in the fighting. It's made itself felt in anti-war demonstrations in Washington this morning and in other cities yesterday, and in the comments from Democrats in Congress over the past 48 hours. The nightly news programs give a feeling that history is repeating itself. This was 2 nights ago.
Reports of Sandinista troops moving from Nicaragua against Contra bases in Honduras.
This was almost exactly 2 years ago.
It is here that at least 2 Sandinista battalions, about 1,500 men, attacked over the weekend.
When the Sandinistas chased the Contras across the border into Honduras in March 1986, Honduras asked America to provide helicopters to fly its troops up to the border. Today, Honduras made the same request. And then, as now, the administration insisted no Americans would be involved in combat. The then White House Chief of Staff in 1986.
Our equipment would be used, our pilots would be used, but we would go nowhere near where the invasion of the Nicaraguan troops into Honduras has taken place.
The Secretary of Defense this morning.
There are no plans for these troops to engage in combat.
And both the 1986 incident and this week's came at a crucial moment in the President's battle with Congress to get more aid for the Contras. 2 years ago, he said the Sandinistas had acted because Congress had cut off the aid.
Well, the Nicaraguan communists took the House vote as a sign, all right. They invaded the territory of Honduras with about 1,500 heavily armed troops, and then they lied about it.
This week, the administration put out the same message about the latest Sandinista attack.
They seem to be going for what we've been calling a killer blow, an effort to crush the freedom fighters while Congress is refusing to give them any aid, and they can't be resupplied.
It's led to deep skepticism on Capitol Hill about the president's motive for ordering the troops to Honduras. Some Democrats are openly accusing him of manufacturing a crisis to frighten Congress into providing more aid.
All of a sudden, the day after the president asked for this Contra aid, now there's a, quote, war going on and an invasion of Honduras.
It is difficult to characterize what we have seen as anything but a public relations campaign aimed at the media to resurrect the failed policy of military aid for the Contras.
Congress voted against Contra aid because the Democrats wanted to give the Central American peace process a chance. Talks between the Contras and the Sandinistas had been scheduled for next week, but with fighting still apparently going on along the Honduras border, prospects don't look good. Edward Sturton, ITN, Washington.
Hello, 2 of Britain's most distinguished writers who feel passionately about a distant country with a population smaller than Yorkshire. Nicaragua has rarely been out of the news since the dictator fled the country after a popular revolution 9 years ago. President Reagan determined to topple the new revolutionary government, and the argument over funding the old dictator's supporters as Contra guerrillas has been one of the major debates in American foreign policy. In the light of all the current affairs coverage of Nicaragua, one extraordinary fact has been generally overlooked. A large number of the key political figures are writers, some of them among the most distinguished writers in Latin America. we decided to look at Nicaragua and ask, why did so many writers become involved in politics? Not all, incidentally, on the government side. And what happens when a country is run by writers?
I think this is the most serious thing that has happened since the Spanish Civil War, in that it appears to be a long way away. It's only a very little country, and who the hell cares? Only 3 million people and so on. And they're all a lot of lousy Central Americans anyway. The fact is, they are attempting to form a civilized, humane society over there, and they're being stopped by us.
I went over to Nicaragua first in 1980, and I've been nearly every year since. So I've met them as political people. One feels they're human beings, and I think that it's very difficult for a writer not to be a human being.
De la Dirección Nacional del Frente Sandinista.
Sergio Ramirez is one of the leading novelists and short story writers in Latin America. He's also the vice president of Nicaragua.
Here in Nicaragua, I will say our main arm against the policies of the Reagan administration has been imagination.
¿Qué sos sino un triangulito de tierra perdido en la mitad del mundo? ¿Qué sos sino un vuelo de pájaros, guardabarrancos, enzontles, colibríes? ¿Qué sos sino un ruido de ríos llevándose las piedras pulidas y brillantes, dejando pisadas de agua por los montes? ¿Qué sos sino pechos de mujer hechos de tierra, lisos, puntudos y amenazantes? ¿Qué sos sino cantar de hojas en árboles gigantes, verdes, enmarañados y llenos de palomas? ¿Qué sos sino dolor y polvo y gritos en la tarde, gritos de mujeres como de parto? ¿Qué sos sino puño crispado y bala en boca? ¿Qué sos, Nicaragua, para dolerme tanto?
Ay, Nicaragua, Nicaragüita, recibe como prenda de amor este ramo de siempre vivas y gilinjoches que hoy florecen para vos cuando yo beso tu frente pura. Beso las perlas de tu sudor, más dulcita que la frutita del tiguilote y el jocote tronando.
El peligro ha sido el silencio, ¿no? El silencio. Las amenazas de muerte cesaron cuando cayó Somoza.
Ahora el pueblo de Nicaragua ha aprendido a leer de lo que quiere y no se le engaña tan fácilmente como sucedía en el pasado. Y los regímenes dictatoriales mantienen a sus pueblos en América Latina precisamente analfabetos para poder tenerlos dominados.
I think we have made a lot of mistakes, but I think we have also made a lot of good things. I think we have accomplished a lot considering how young we were, how inexperienced we were, and the war.
Ay, Nicaragua, Nicaragüita,
Good evening. President Daniel Ortega has agreed to hand over power in Nicaragua after his unexpected election defeat. For the last 8 years, his Sandinista movement has fought off the Washington-backed Contra rebels. But today, the man President Bush once described as a skunk at a garden party conceded defeat at the hands of politicians sponsored by the United States. Until today, Nicaragua has been the United States' principal antagonist in Central America. Now it will be ruled by UNO, a coalition of opposition parties led by Violeta Chamorro. With 2/3 of the votes counted, she's polled more than 54%, compared with President Ortega's Sandinista party, who so far have polled only 41.5%.
Defeat in Nicaragua. After a revolution, a decade in power, and a bloody civil war, Daniel Ortega and his Sandinista regime accepted their overwhelming rejection, sadly, but with dignity. Victory in Nicaragua. The UNO opposition celebrate one of Latin America's most astonishing electoral upsets, as voters who turned out in massive numbers at Sandinista rallies deserted the party at the polling booths. The new president-elect, Violeta Chamorro, more than 10% ahead of the better-organized Ortega campaign, promised a government of national salvation. UNO is an unlikely coalition, 14 different anti-Sandinista political parties ranging from conservative to communist. The vice president-elect explained what holds UNO together.
What unifies the opposition is the uncertainty in the future. A general feeling of insecurity exists in the country and is a product of the destructive Sandinista policies.
Mrs. Chamorro won because she harnessed that national mood after 10 years tired of war, economic misery, inflation peaking at 33,000%, of Sandinista Marxism with a Nicaraguan accent.
We want change. We don't want to live like this. We're tired of this. We're bored of all this. We want the world to know we don't want this. We want democracy. We want freedom.
Violeta Chamorro is the widow of a publisher murdered in 1978 by the forces of the dictator Somoza while trying to bring democracy to his country. Pedro Chamorro was so popular, the revolutionary Daniel Ortega and Violeta walked side by side in his memory. But the mourners soon split into political factions. Violeta laid a wreath at her husband's tomb before going on to defeat the Sandinistas at the polls.
I think she's an extraordinary woman, a woman of instinct. But she's a woman who can tell, who can smell perhaps, the difference between what's good and bad. And I am sure, that whatever role she has to play of bringing around her men who can go and negotiate with the Sandinistas, social peace, she will do it beautifully.
As for the Sandinistas, their planned victory party quickly faded, the revolutionaries shocked rather than angry in defeat. Yet in a truly statesmanlike way, the man who surprisingly did bring democracy to Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, accepted defeat gracefully, though some of the regime's military and security hardliners were not with him on the platform. There was one touch of defiance, his revolutionary slogan.
Y adelante con nuestro lucha de patria libre.
Forward with the struggle for country or death. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter summed up on behalf of the thousands of election observers.
The most gratifying thing to us, and perhaps a surprise to many, has been the startling exhibition of reconciliation that has already been commenced.
In Latin America, failed politicians often go for their guns, end up dead or in jail. But if Daniel Ortega does become the loyal opposition, then a revolution has arrived. Peaceful political change in Nicaragua. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Managua.
In Washington, President Bush congratulated Violeta Chamorro on her victory and praised Daniel Ortega for agreeing to abide by the election result. President Bush indicated that the United States was now considering how to end its years of hostility towards Nicaragua. In this remarkable year of change, he said, democracy has won another victory.
President Bush had been warned by his advisers that his bête noire, Daniel Ortega, was cruising to victory and had been preparing to bite the bullet. So undisguised relief and probably concealed delight prompted his first reaction.
We hope now for a peaceful transition, for the institutionalization of the democratic process in Nicaragua. And there is space in a democratic Nicaragua for all political points of view.
Mr. Bush once likened Mr. Ortega to a skunk. Mrs. Chamorro got VIP treatment just for opposing him, so she can now be assured of White House backing to try and make sure she succeeds as the country's new leader. And for once on Central American policy, the White House and Congress seem to be in unison.
As I look around this hemisphere at Panama, Nicaragua, Cuba, it seems to me it is 2 down and 1 to go. Noriega is history, and now so is Ortega.
It has not always been so chummy. For nearly a decade, the Reagan administration poured military aid to the Contra insurgents to try and bring down Mr. Ortega and his Sandinistas. That backfired when the White House ignored Congress's ban on military aid. It was the Reagan administration that was almost brought down. The sight of Mr. Ortega and his friend Fidel Castro apparently thumbing their noses at Washington drove Mr. Reagan to distraction. That led to the Iran-Contra scandal, the sale of arms to Iran to provide funds for the Contras. It toppled several Reagan aides. Oliver North was convicted of criminal offenses. Mr. Reagan's national security advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, is still facing charges, and the repercussions continue to reverberate. Only last week, ex-President Reagan gave videotaped evidence once again denying he played a direct role in the affair. The scandal put an end to military aid to the Contras, but Mr. Bush tightened his economic blockade and gave £5 million towards Mrs. Chamorro's election campaign. Today it paid off, and now Mr. Bush is rushing to put together an aid package to help Mrs. Chamorro get Nicaragua out of the economic mess brought about largely by US sanctions. He's likely to end those sanctions. Washington may be heaving a big sigh of relief that what they regarded as a troublesome regime on their doorstep has been toppled peacefully, but the administration is aware that Nicaragua's new rulers will need every bit of help to succeed. Keith Graves, BBC News, Washington.
She says the elections show Nicaraguans want to live in democracy, peace and liberty. Foreign observers in Nicaragua say the elections were fair and legitimate. In Washington, President Bush welcomed Mrs. Chamorro's victory and called for the immediate re-establishment of a ceasefire between the government and the Contra rebels. With just under 2/3 of the votes counted, Mrs. Chamorro's National Opposition Union is comfortably ahead with 54%. Daniel Ortega's Sandinistas have 41%. The National Opposition Union is an anti-Sandinista coalition of 14 parties, ranging from the Communist Party on the left to the National Conservative Party on the right. Our Washington correspondent Michael Crick followed the results and reports on the US government's reaction to the defeat of its long-time Sandinista adversary.
Nicaragua's opposition coalition celebrates an election victory that confounded most of the opinion polls and looks set to open a new chapter in American policy in Central America.
Nicaraguense! I ask the people of Nicaragua to remain calm. This election will produce no exiles, no political prisoners, no confiscations.
By early this morning, Violeta Chamorro had built up an unassailable majority to oust a left-wing Nicaraguan government that survived for more than 10 years, despite determined economic and military efforts from Washington to defeat it. Though the results were slow to emerge, former US President Jimmy Carter and several hundred other international observers declared the balloting and counting to be fair.
Yes, very fair. They're very meticulous, very careful counting the ballots.
Last night, the Sandinistas had been preparing a huge victory rally, but it seems that victory was denied by Nicaraguans fed up with appalling economic conditions made all the worse by American sanctions. And this morning, the Sandinista president had to concede defeat.
We went to the polls on February 25, 1990, believing that the electoral contest must produce once and for all an end to the war and a little peace, stability, and tranquility.
But Daniel Ortega is far from dead politically. His party got more than 40% of the vote,
and the last 10 years have shown just how good he is at surviving.
Ese Frente Sandinista.
The Sandinista Front, with its revolutionary government, stood during the last 10 years, hard, difficult years, and at times cruel for the Nicaraguan people, stood at the head of the defense of the people's interest, stood at the head of the defense of the nation and national dignity, of sovereignty, stood at the head of the fight for Nicaragua's self-determination.
Nicaragua's new president, Violeta Chamorro, is a newspaper publisher whose own family actually contains several Sandinistas. Yesterday, she laid a wreath on the grave of her husband, murdered 12 years ago by the former dictator Anastasio Somoza. And ironically, that assassination actually sparked the Sandinista revolution. Though she's an important Cory Aquino-style figurehead, Mrs. Chamorro has little political experience. She emerged from a coalition of 14 parties that range from far right to far left, including communists, all of them united by little more than hatred of the Sandinistas.
They are going to have very different visions of where to lead Nicaragua once the UNO coalition actually takes over the executive branch of government. There will probably be internal arguments, splits, perhaps even some parties may leave the coalition, but they have now a very big incentive, of course, to hold together.
She is very well respected by all the 14 political leaders. She is going to be able to have them all together in the government, putting in place the government program that we all agreed upon.
But even before the election, leading elements in the Nicaraguan military suggested they might not concede power readily. And it may be hard for Mrs. Chamorro's coalition to assume controls of a power structure where Sandinistas hold even some of the most minor positions.
The armed forces, of course, is full of Sandinista officers and many loyalists among the regular troops as well. So the opposition is going to have to be very sensitive to that, and I think be careful about trying to purge the armed forces overnight of Sandinistas.
But what of the Army's long-standing opponents in Nicaragua's civil war, the American-backed Contra guerrillas? The Contras continued sporadic attacks right up until last week. But this morning in Washington, President Bush, surprised by the election result, called for an end to the fighting.
Given the clear mandate for peace and democracy, there is no reason at all for further military activity from any quarter, and we hope the ceasefire will be reestablished without delay and respected by all sides.
Mr. Bush has actually sent Daniel Ortega a message congratulating him on the conduct of the poll. Today, he was urgently considering ending sanctions and restoring full diplomatic ties with Nicaragua. But powerful congressmen are urging that Mrs. Chamorro must get far more than that.
We must provide her new government with aid. And let's not kid ourselves, we're talking about big bucks in aid. If any newly elected leader ever faced an economic and social emergency, Mrs. Chamorro does. She needs our help and she deserves it. But it raises the same old question. Where are we going to get the money?
As with Eastern Europe and Panama, Washington may find that it's easier to encourage democratic processes than it is to help the survival of democracy with hard cash and financial aid. Michael Crick, ITN, Washington.
Well, joining us now from Washington to discuss the events in Nicaragua is Elliot Abrams, former Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Central American policy under President Reagan. Mr. Abrams, was it worth the bloodshed and the economic suffering to bring about this change?
Well, the real judges of that have to be the people of Nicaragua, but I think the answer is yes. They obviously wanted to get rid of this dictatorship. They did what was done in Chile, what was done in the Philippines, what's been done in Eastern Europe. They got rid of a dictatorship they didn't want, and this was, it took 10 years to do it, but I think it would have been a terrible mistake to just give it up.
But then on the other hand, one could also say that the Americans have spent the last 10 years also trying to get rid of the Sandinista government. Will they, do you think now, will the United States allow events to take their own course in Nicaragua?
Well, I think so. I think this was a very, it was a bitter dispute in the United States, but that dispute is essentially over. The only question now is probably just how much aid can Mrs. Chamorro get. But there's a kind of celebratory feeling in Washington now because even Democrats actually were quite fed up with the Sandinistas and wanted them out.
On the other hand, there are lessons surely to have been learnt from these 10 years, from the way in which Washington can bring its influence to bear in a country like Nicaragua. It had to resort in the end to war to do it, didn't it?
Yes, but I'm not sure where the lesson is. It seems to me that if you compare Cuba, which is now 30 years later still communist, to Nicaragua, which is now going to move in the direction of democracy, one can make a very good argument that, and I would argue, that what the Reagan administration did kept hope alive, that the Contras kept hope alive until the day that the Sandinistas could be strong-armed or pushed into a free election. And then they were shocked, as General Pinochet was shocked and as Marcos in the Philippines was shocked, to learn that when given the chance, people actually voted against them.
Well, now put yourself in your old seat for a moment. You are faced tonight in the State Department with a government that looks as if it's going to be made up with communists, conservatives, Christian Democrats. What do you think the future looks like in Nicaragua?
I think it looks a lot like Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia or Romania or Poland. That is, you'll have a period now in which the opposition, now the new government, is going to be fragmented. The largest single group is still probably the Sandinistas. They're going to be heavily dependent for the next year or two on foreign economic aid. There's going to be a problem now with not so much the military, I would argue, as the secret police, the Ministry of the Interior, in making sure that it really comes under civilian control. But it's very much now the kind of thing we see in Eastern Europe, with all of those attendant problems.
Now, what happens to that group of military people that were spawned by your department, your administration, the Contras? There are 15,000 of them still under arms somewhere around on Nicaragua's borders. They could still represent a very serious problem. They may not wish to go away as easily as you would wish them to.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think that they are Nicaraguans who are fighting to get their country out from under communism. They are among the people who will celebrate this victory, and they will go home now. Most of them have an average age, you know, of 18, 19, 20, and they'll go back to the farms that they used to have. The leadership, I think, will probably go home and run for office. The Sandinistas are the largest party in the National Assembly. I think you'll see Sandinistas, Contras, Christian Democrats, and everybody else in the National Assembly fighting it out in the way they should be fighting it out, which is peacefully.
Elliot Abrahams, thank you very much for joining us from Washington.